Roland's Curse, released in 1991 for the Game Boy, courtesy of American Sammy and developed by NMK. I honestly didn't know what to make of this one, folks. At first glance, this game looks fairly similar to typical RPG fare you'd get on the consoles around this time, like a Dragon Quest or a Final Fantasy type. But the heads-up display with its A and B slots denotes gameplay more akin to Zelda, and that's sort of what you're getting with Roland's Curse, except it's not even close to being as deep as any of those games. Roland's Curse is divided into 3 chapters that play out the same way. You start off in a town talking to people who will offer nothing of value other than some mild encouragement. Once you leave town, you'll have to navigate labyrinths of forests, caves, castles, dungeons, and other places, killing monsters and collecting whatever wares you come across, whether it be life-extending chainmails or other tools such as shields, power crystals, and obstacle-clearing pickaxes. Now, in the aforementioned games, these items would be added to your inventory, stored for later use whenever you needed them. But in Roland's Curse, you could only carry one of these items at a time, meaning if you had a potion of life on hand, and then you come across a chameleon ring and you pick it up, that ring replaces your potion of life. So you have to decide whether the new item is worth giving up your old one, and in this case, there's only 2 items worth keeping. The pickaxe to clear away certain obstacles, which will usually lead to a shortcut or maybe some treasure chest out of the way that could contain some valuable item, and the aforementioned Potion of Life, which serves as a one-time refill whenever you need it, and there are times where you're going to need it. You start a new game armed with a sword, but eventually can replace that sword with a fire wand that shoots ranged projectiles. You can replace your infinitely more useful fire wand by picking up another sword, but that would be foolhardy given that enemies do tremendous damage upon contact. Your window of recovery after each hit is exceedingly brief, while enemies continue along their merry way as they're getting pelted with blows. And finally, your hero moves slower than goose shit, which is the real killer of Roland's Curse. So aside from items that you can only hold one at a time for your A and B slots, there are other item drops as well. Chainmails, which act as heart piece containers that extend your life, except these can be dropped by enemies, and since enemies tend to spawn from specific points, you can take the time to farm for these life extensions if you want to. Not that it really matters, because once you start a new chapter, you lose those extensions. See, Roland's Curse has 2 stats you could build upon, attack power and life power. But these stats have 2 further stats, one that is built up temporarily by picking up chainmails and weapons, and also a more permanent stat that sticks for the rest of the game. And these permanent stats are built up by collecting heart containers for life and gauntlets for attack power. It's needlessly convoluted nonsense that Roland's Curse tries to pass off as deep gameplay because it couldn't be bothered to flesh out the rest of the stuff that could actually benefit from being fleshed out. Roland's Curse may have you venturing through labyrinthian caverns, castles, dungeons, and other such terrain, but do not assume this is non-linear, open-ended exploration because it's not. Between the starting town and the end boss sits a series of interconnected mazes that you have to navigate to go from point A to point B. And while there are some chests to be discovered to contain valuable items, they're usually blocked off by some obstacle that requires a pickaxe to clear away, assuming you found one, and also assuming you didn't get some other worthless item like a chameleon ring or something to replace that pickaxe if you already had it. And look, the biggest issue I have with Roland's Curse is that it's a very shallow game that wants to present itself as a grand adventure for the player to embark on, but doesn't go so far as to include all the components needed to make said adventure worthwhile. Honestly, if you're going to make a Zelda ripoff, you may as well go the whole way, and this game never really does that. You don't have an inventory to store items, you're mostly stuck on a linear path. The towns are mostly for show, you can't get into houses, the non-playable characters offer nothing of value, there's no currency or shop system to stock up on extra goods, and when it comes to navigating these maps, some of which eventually gets recycled later down the road, I'm sorry, but where the fuck do I go is a question I often ask myself, especially when the terrain looks terribly similar, and given that there's just so many maps you have to get through that the whole thing becomes an exercise in outright tedium. Not helping matters is the somewhat lackluster control. Not to say that it's all bad, they work, they function, they're responsive. But as I've said, your hero's a fucking sloth that moves at barely a snail's pace, while all your foes are moving at warp speed in comparison, which makes it difficult to dodge their advances. More than lack of substance, this is the other thing that cripples the overall experience. Just about the only saving grace is that whenever you die, you'll respawn at the last gate you'll pass through with all your stats and gear intact, so it's not a total loss and you seemingly have unlimited tries. But should you want to put the game down and continue another time, you could just pause the game and write down the passcode to resume your progress later down the road. That said, Roland's Curse only has 3 chapters to play through, and as a whole, the game can be completed in roughly a couple hours at most. So it's not a long game, it's not an impossible game. There's enough to offset the absolute horrid player movement. But man, I don't even have the heart to say that this was half-assed. This was more like quarter-assed, if that. Roland's Curse looks like typical RPG fare you'd associate with the platform at the time. Tile-based stuff, that sort of thing. And for what it's worth, the graphics are fine, I guess. The smallish sprites have a bit of detail to them, and the terrain, while repetitive, is nice to look at least. Few bosses that you have to fight are also a sight impressive, even if their death animations leave much to be desired. On the flip side, however, sound is mediocre. The music is nothing special, just short loops of some admittedly decent compositions that wear out their welcome fairly quickly, and some so-so sound effects. That's it. I've had to struggle with my thoughts on Roland's Curse. The idea is sound, but the execution is not so much. There's a tease of a great game, but that tease is stretched out to a couple hours of gameplay, and the one component that seems thought out is actually overcomplication for the sake of overcomplication. Roland's Curse feels incomplete, shallow, more of a sampler of other games of this ilk that does the formula way the fuck better. It is playable, however. It is competent enough, and the challenge is largely conquerable. So based on that alone, I cannot in good conscience call Roland's Curse a bad game, because it really isn't. But even with tempered expectations, Roland's Curse leaves much to be desired, and only serves to remind the player of games they could be playing right about now, instead of this. But then again, this got a sequel, so whatever.